reinforcements. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing their dynamic relationship. You can read more about them in the website, in the learning section, in the Monster Doc, reference, and so on and so on. So if you want more elaborate descriptions, go there. It won't happen here. There are 7. And this is my take, which, you know, is incomplete because I'm not trained as a cranial neurologist. There are a lot of people that, even well-trained, are learning these things because it's new. Okay, so you've got what I call the big 3. You've got the default mode network, the cognitive control network, and the limbic network. Now these are pretty standardized names, but they're not unified with all practitioners because there are subdivisions in neurology. Even different countries will label them a little differently. So don't be surprised if you see it referred to in some place and the name is kind of similar but not exactly the same. These are reasonably standardized. Okay, default mode network, cognitive control network, and limbic network. The default mode network is kind of, you know, you're curious about that right away just based on the name. It's the default mode. So that must mean that if something else is not happening, this is happening. It's your default. It's like on your computer, your default browser. When you open up, boom, there it is, your default. So the default mode, generally speaking, and is an assembly of different parts of the brain, is when there's no evident or obvious task that you're doing. It's the default mode. It takes over when, simply put, you're not in task mode. You know, it goes a lot further than that, but that's a simple way of thinking about it. It doesn't mean that you're meditating. It doesn't mean that you're sleeping. It's like listening to a story, ruminating, not in a negative way, reflecting on your thoughts, kind of, you know, you're just there. It's a very positive state, and it's the state that allows you to go into task or action when you need to. Default mode network is incredibly fascinating, and I encourage you to study more, learn more about it. For example, there are 2, and there are many others, 2 ways of disrupting the default mode network. One is with hallucinogenics, and the other is dream sleep. In both cases, the default mode network is taken out of organization. So, you know, it's a little, I'm cautious to synthesize because I don't want to oversimplify. But basically for people that have a hard time turning it off, the default mode network should be reinforced because that's where the brain settles when you're not in task. So if you're always perpetually in a doing mode, even when you apparently aren't doing, but you have the disposition, the tendency to feel doing, thinking, planning, you know, having the default mode network reinforced or brought forward is a positive experience. Catherine?
Does it go there during a calm, heading into a type of meditation state?
I don't know the actual answer to that.
Okay.
That would seem reasonable, but I'll say I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
You know, this is a rapidly developing field.
It's interesting.
So, you know, what is known now is understood to be incomplete.
Okay.
There's more and more discovery that's going on all the time. So that's the default mode. Yes.
Garnet, do you have any sources that you would recommend that we look at that may have been helpful for you in understanding the default mode?
You know, go online. It's the simplest thing. You know, search default mode network in parentheses, and it'll do that. The thing is that there are books, published books now. They tend to be really pretty technical.
Well, was there anything that you particularly liked that you think would be helpful?
No, see, I have to say that my impressions are summary.
Okay.
That I read really like gnarly research and I strain at it, maybe I get 50% of it. There aren't any very well popularized books. So, but if you like, even Wikipedia You can start there. It's just a pretty good description. And of course it develops, and then you get links and associations. That's what I would recommend.
And I feel like Joe Dispenza talked about it.
Everybody.
You know who doesn't, I guess.
They all, even
Yeah.
you know, with the flow guys, you know, Kotler and Stealing Fire and extreme states to induce what they call flow. One of the characteristics of inducing what they call flow is actually a disruption of the default mode network, that you're not allowed to go home. So it creates this hyper state that they like. It's flow, but flow states are very transient, you can't sustain them, and the common ways of inducing flow states are extreme activities, especially with threat. You kind of scare the pants out of your brain, and it won't go into the default mode network. It goes into hypervigilant uncommon states, which feel amazing, but are not well understood.
So it's a passive state.
Well, it's not
But-
passive.
but-
It allows a certain type of activity that when you're not in a specific task mode, that activity is allowed. To like listening to a great story, where you're just in the story, you're absorbed by it, you'll see a dominance of the default mode network. It puts you in a receptive state where you're not active or reactive. You're in this state which is not sleep, it's not a meditation, it's not a trance state. It's where it's like neutral. If you have a stick shift, it's like neutral.
So you can't say it's parasympathetic state versus sympathetic. You can't define it that simply.
I can't. Maybe somebody can.
I'm liking this state. I want to be in it.
Well, you know, getting out of task mode it's not necessarily a productive state,
Right.
but it, you know, okay, again, if you've got a 4-speed manual, it's neutral, right? And it allows you to go into other gears. It's not a perfect analogy, but anyway, you know, right now, we could spend the whole day just on brain networks, I tell you. Because it's so revolutionary in appreciating how the brain works adaptively. You'll see as we talk a little bit more. So I've written about it, it's in the material. And this is a practicum training, so I don't want to drift too far into theory, right? I want to help you connect theory quickly to practicum so you know how to use it for real. Okay. These three relate to each other, which is why I call them the big three, so you'll understand. The cognitive control network is like the CEO. It shifts into task mode and oftentimes delegates. So it'll help delegate into other networks. The cognitive control network, the kind of the imagery that I like to use is that there are two individuals, one the default mode network, the other is the cognitive control network, 2 people, 1 chair, which means they have to share. When one is dominant, the other is subordinate. I mean, roughly, when one turns on, the other turns off, right? So, I mean, that's a bit like cutting with a sharp knife, but they trade dominance. They can't both be dominant at the same time. Okay. So, that's really interesting. The easiest way to recognize kind of the actuality of the cognitive control is when a person is able to begin to observe the experience as opposed to being in or engulfed in the experience.
I like that.
Yeah. So when you want a person to start to shift towards neutral observer or curious observer, reinforcing the cognitive control network is really good, because they'll feel more easily disposed to that very slight, and the word sounds negative, but that very slight disassociation from the moment. Everybody talks about being in the now, being in the moment, being present. You know, like the here and now. That's a metaphor, right? Presence doesn't mean a moment in time or a place in space, right? Now sounds like, oh, now. It's like, God damn, now, right? It's not a.
Very hard thing.
No, it's not a point in time. It's a metaphor. And being here, now, here is not a place in space. It's not, well, better not move. No, if I move my elbow, I'm not here, I'm there, you know. This misinterpretation, this effortful concept of be here now presence is not literal. But we speak in terms of time and space because we're three-dimensional beings experiencing time and space. So the cognitive control network allows mindfulness. It reinforces that. But mindfulness is not the end goal. Mindfulness is not pure presence. It's bridging. It's so that you're not, experience is not so sticky. But in and of itself, mindfulness is still a step in the stage towards presence, which is sometimes called, in translation, calm abiding, where the here and now is a state. It's a quality, not a measure of quantity, like how much am I here, how much am I now. It's qualitative, it's not quantitative. So the cognitive control network is this fascinating effect that you can utilize when you want a person to begin to even just notice without judgment. Right? It's great. And see, that's not a characteristic of the default mode network. That's not a characteristic of that, which is why these two networks share dominance.
Those are good analogies to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I say it's like two people in one chair.
So going back to the default,
Yeah.
one of the distinctions that I may be picking up is that the default, there is no judgment or critical thinking or kind of active processing.
No, you're just there.
So-
You're.
So again, passive or what?
It's like, the clouds go by and, you're not being particularly attentive to any one of them, but you're aware of them. You're not,
You're not identifying.
You're not
saying
dulled
that looks-
out.
that
It's just
looks
that-
like a rabbit, that looks like a lion.
no, not like that.
Is it like doing housekeeping, basic housekeeping happening?
Well, if the task is habituated enough, meaning that you don't have to be consciously doing it, then any experience, and read more about it, because different people are writing about it now. It does this, does that, and what you realize is that disabling the default mode network is one of the techniques to end up in a space that is not task, but it's not default, it's uncommon. So it's this attraction of, what is this? It's this heightened state of unusual, what's normally called non-ordinary consciousness states, right? NOx. Non-ordinary states. You can have a person go into non-ordinary if you disable the default without engaging the cognitive. It's like, where am I? It's like in this netherworld, this middle zone, and in like a vacuum, a consciousness vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. This suspended, uncommon, or non-ordinary state rushes in unconscious imagery, things stored in your experience, cultural symbolism, the stuff you don't normally have in the forefront will rush into that because the brain hates nonsense. It'll always try to derive meaningful from the meaningless. It wants to convert nonsense into sense. So when you're in this state, the person will say, oh, I'm flying, or it feels like I'm flying. It's metaphoric. They're not really flying, but the thing from their unconscious or their cultural experience will let them label this metaphorically. It's as though I am flying, but they may actually feel like I am flying. That distinction at that point is very hard to make. It's very hard to really disassociate the metaphoric with the actual when you're in those states, especially if they're uncommon to you. Look at what happens because the default mode network is disabled in dreams. And dreams are highly fluid and tangential and image rich and unpredictable. And in dream yoga, one of the very first steps is to be able to know that I am dreaming. No, wait, this is a dream. You see how, we'll talk later today about neuroplastic reinforcements and the power of label. But anyway, so I don't want to go too far right now, but the idea, to make it, again, risking oversimplification, reinforcing the default mode network is great for people that can't turn it off. And reinforcing the cognitive control network is very good for people that can't turn it on. They can't get into task mode. They can't conjure that up very easily, the first meridian than you. So you can see, in this two-person dance for one chair, that it creates a generalized disposition that you get to work with. So working with a brain network reinforcement, then going into the brain skills, is a really nice way of one thing leading to another, first things first. It's like stupid to say, but it's kind of like a warm-up for where you want them to go. Your question?
So I'm just wondering, using for a metaphor, breathing.
Say, for what was it?
Using for a metaphor, breathing.
Breathing?
The space between the inhale and the exhale, would that actually be the
Default mode?
Yeah, the default mode, or would that be more in a state that you were talking about, where
The non-common, the uncommon, the non-ordinary. I won't give an answer because I'm not clear how to respond to that. I would say it's an interesting thing to explore, but I don't know the answer. Yeah.
So when I hear you say someone having a hard time turning it off,
Yes.
the state opposite to that in mind is a state of being at ease.
Mm-hmm.
And so could you kind of parallel it to a state more being at ease?
I would risk that.
Okay.
I'm not. I have to
I'm
say.
struggling, but
Well, me too. I mean, the point is that
Mm.
all of neuroscience is struggling with this right now. The evidence is overwhelming. The degree of recognition and clarity is improving day by day by day. There are assumptions turning into understandings, but it's still the Wild West. It's a magnificent area to be working in, especially in recognition of neuroplasticity. When there are these networks that dispose a person towards certain generalized brain states, and seeing them come alive and go to sleep, seeing them go from near chaos into temporary order using these networks, it's a break-open area in neuroscience right now. So, I'm not so clever enough to know these things and also create compositions with them 6 months ago, and also know how to apply them specifically for all the conditions. If I'm 10% there, I'm very, very lucky, because nobody's 100% anywhere in this. So, please accept my best efforts at characterizing them and explaining how to use them, but understand that there are gaps in my own understanding that are still significant. But it's not because I'm derelict or something, it's just that a lot of people don't know. Okay, the third one, I said there were the big three: default mode network, cognitive control network, and the limbic network. The limbic network is critically involved with emotional states and many other things. It's, to me, the most important thing about the limbic network is that it's the network that has the primary responsibility of assessing the inflow of stimulation as experience and essentially determining whether it's a threat or not. And this is hugely important because it's a deep, deep, deep mechanism in the central nervous system. If you follow the evolutionary process, nothing is very important if you're dead. So assessing whether something is threatening your survival or not has to be really, really deeply embedded in our psyche. And it is. And it is. So as stimulation flows in, the limbic system has this assessing capacity that's swirled into emotional processing. So what happens is an emergent feeling state that kind of like a geyser or a fountain goes up into the cortex, where you assign thoughts relating to your feelings. So this, the second step, if you will, is where you tell a story about the experience that you're feeling. So as I've said before, we are feeling creatures that think. We're not thinking creatures that feel. And if the limbic system is confused, or even not confused, but the emotional states are perhaps overwhelming and maybe even expressing negatively, one of the tricks is to bring the cognitive control network into dominance, because like the default mode, it tends to subordinate the limbic. So that's one of the reasons why, and I'll explain it in neuroplastic reinforcements. This is why when you're in a negative emotional state with even negative thoughts, just labeling the experience, oh, I am having fear. That labeling process engages the cognitive control and disengages the limbic.
It's one of the techniques involving pediatric neuroscience on behavior and how to best approach a child.
Yeah.
The first thing that you do is you get lower eye contact, so you're the least threat possible. Second thing you do is you recognize the big emotion they're having, and that switches it from that lower dominant, what they call the reptilian brain, allowing to the shift to happen. But it's a well-established technique for toddlers freaking out.
See, it's very interesting because toddlers their brain is not fully developed at all. So there are lots of things they can't do. Especially, you take it all the way into teenagers, I've mentioned this, but the prefrontal cortex, which is involved with the cognitive control, apparently is the highly involved. I won't say the seat, that sounds like Cartesian thinking, the seat of the soul, the pineal, all that. But that discriminatory reasoning has not yet been fully activated in the teenager, because the prefrontal cortex is still rapidly developing, so it's quite difficult for them to make discriminatory decisions. They won't know how to evaluate that for decision making. So give them a break,
Well, it's incredible to watch a tantrum toddler being able to shift by just the recognition of what they're feeling.
So
the big emotion.
Yeah, so this is part of this triad of default mode, cognitive control, and limbic, that they really kind of dance together a lot. And by knowing when to come in and out of it, there will be a lot of success in labeling, which is one of the processes in untangling the limbic trauma loop, which is quite an advanced brain-shaping process, is helping the person understand that not every sensation they feel is accurate or appropriate, not every emotion is accurate and appropriate, not every thought is accurate and appropriate. Because the limbic system that is involved in these feeling states is doing a lot of false reporting, hypersensitized false reporting. So once blah, 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 in terms of technique, but one of the things involved is that you bring the cognitive control network on board so that they begin to become an observer, or either neutral, or as I say, the curious observer at least, where you still kind of own the experience, but you're curious about it. Because bringing the cognitive control in subordinates the limbic, so that the limbic is being brought down in profile so that you can begin to readjust from the cognitive by being an observer. And the state that follows the observer in the methodology is when you begin to label. So you see that there's really, now with techniques that have had apparent success in the past, maybe without mechanism, but psychologically recognized as beneficial, now with the neuroscience and the brain imaging, it's much easier to confirm and maybe then even extend some of these methodologies, because now there's a lot of brain imaging and the networks are pretty well understood. Or they just proposed, like they, us, we, somebody, proposed, even just like 2 or 3 months ago, a consciousness network based on, I wish she was here, your friend, based on studies in anesthesiology and brain trauma and brain surgery, recognizing there are certain components that when they come together, boom, you're conscious, and when they boom, and it's more than just the disabling the biochemistry of sensory reporting. It's an actual network that is helping go from the near chaos of unconscious to temporary order of anyway. So networks are still evolving. Okay, big three, Kaya.
I think I might have misinterpreted or tried to correlate an exact coupling of limbic and the autonomic nervous system being the same thing.
Yeah, they're not. They're highly related. The limbic system will report out of the central nervous system into the autonomic.
Okay.
Right? Because we have, of course, famously, if you want to go deep into the neuroscience, study polyvagal theory. That's all I'll say about that. But if there's threat, fight or flight is famous. They say, in the expression, there's a kind of what's called a social harmony state. That's when you're not in fight or flight, and you move harmoniously in your experience and your experience as it relates to your environment. So it's oftentimes referred to as social harmony. And if social harmony is threatened, then boom, instead of the sympathetic, parasympathetic in harmony, it moves into a dominant sympathetic fight or flight. Right? And fight or flight is actually quite an evolved state of dealing with threat in terms of the evolutionary process and the development of the central nervous system. Because I had said before, the central nervous system through evolution develops from the bottom up, not from the top down. So you start with the spinal cord, then you go into the low brain, then middle brain, high brain, to make it like stages. So if fight or flight can be effective, they're used. If you have enough strength to fight, or the weapons, claws, and beaks, or if you have the legs and metabolism to flee, then that's effective at dispersing threat. But if you can do neither one of those, if you're not strong enough to fight, and you're not fast enough to flee, then you go into an even older threat response, which is freeze. There's fight, flight, freeze. Freeze is play dead.
Awesome.
Yeah, the possum technique. And many, many, many animals use it still. The way the deer will just freeze. And the thing about freeze is that it's been very effective, it still exists. Things that work along the lines of evolution, if you can just think of it simply that way, are retained. Anything that works is retained. So we humans also can go into play dead or freeze. If we can't fight it off, if we can't escape, and the threat persists, play dead, freeze. The problem with that is that if it's sustained as a method, then the person is increasingly disassociating from their existence, from the me. And it starts off with a disassociation process. Psychologically, it goes emotionally, and then somatically, where they don't feel. In nature, when a being goes into the freeze state, the breathing slows down, heart rate slows down, everything slows down. Because if you say, "Oh, I'm here, and I'm huffing and puffing," you're going to be seen. It won't work. So that's why you can look. I've oftentimes say, I work with these gibbons, and a while ago I was with them in their sanctuary, and they're doing a particular vocalization. I know it's a little bit of gibbon language, and they're telling me there's something there, and both of them, and they're right there hovering over, looking. It's there. I'm pointing down to the base of the tripod here. It's like 3 feet away, and they're both there, and they're looking right at it, and they're both making the whoop 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 whoop, the threat alarm sound. And I said, guys, I'm right here. I'm the same distance as you from that point on the ground. I'm looking right at it for a long time. Did something go by? Was it a snake and it went away, or like why are and there? It's not vague. And I'm looking, and I swear, maybe it was 2 minutes, which is a long time to stare at something. I say, you know, I see some old leaves. That's it. And then a toad about as big as my hand almost jumped away. I'm looking right at that thing. Now maybe they're more clever than me, living in the rainforest, or maybe they saw it move, then it stopped moving. I don't know. But that toad was not there as far as I'm concerned. And I mean, literally, I'm staring right at it because the two gibbons are looking right at a point. So if I triangulate, you know, him, her, me, so the danger, well, in animals, including human animals, is that we can be driven further and further and further into that. So that's when people are like physically abused, and you know, they're not even there in their body, whether they're being, you know, physically or sexually abused or something, or even emotionally. You know, I'm not here. Or they will induce pain, because it's better to feel pain than feel nothing. It's easier to induce pain than to induce pleasure. So, you know, that's the psyche wanting to work out of disassociation, out of the freeze, out of the I'm not here into I am here. But if the situation is something you can't fight your way out of, or you can't escape out of, then to survive you will play dead. So this triangulation of default mode network, cognitive control, and limbic is incredibly fertile for people in life to understand, and working with movement, mental, or sensory to help a person find their way back out of that is a challenging, this is not help right now, this is brain shaping, but by degree there will be people, you know, understanding it and using it. And the Neuralite as an instrument is capable of relating to that process. Okay? Ready?
I was just wondering, I have a couple of people who've had severe trauma. And
Yes.
one would characterize the situation
What
as
is your last name?
numb. Really, they're very numb. And
Yeah,
they
you
want
don't
to feel
feel.
more, they want to be more present in life.
Yeah,
And they feel like they disappear a lot.
yeah.
I'm wondering if the cognitive network would be the place to work to help.
Well, yes, but you know, I may have said on camera or not, these are complicated people to work with. It takes a matured practitioner, it takes a while to get used to the instrument. That's number one. Always start where they are and help them go where they need to go. You can't just do something for them to be where they need to go. And what I had expressed earlier, if a person is in that numb state, believe me, this is serious. It's not, you know, interesting. It's serious. So you have to treat that with respect. If you don't have the knowledge base to work there,